All right, as folks come into the room, welcome. We are glad to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining today. My name is Joe Swimmer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Episcopal Parish Network. I'm thrilled to be hosting, along with our good friends at Forma, this discussion about faith formation today and into the future, something that is so critical for our members and for the church as a whole in this moment. We are glad that you're taking time out to join this group in the discussion. And I would ask that if you have questions or comments, please place them into the chat feature, not the Q&A, place them into the chat. Also, if you have a chance, we would welcome you to enter your home information, where you are calling in from, your name and your parish or cathedral that you might be dialing in to this Zoom for. This session is being recorded. You will get a link to it if you registered through our Eventbrite site. That will come out tomorrow morning, and feel free to share it far and wide. Final note, if you are not an EPN member, an Episcopal Parish Network member, we invite you to learn more about EPN. So you can send us a message at info@episcopalparishes.org. And we would love to see you at our annual conference next year, coming up in Houston, March 6th through 9th. So please mark your calendars and join us in Houston, March 6th through 9th. But until then, we're going to have a great conversation about faith formation, and I am now going to hand it off to Sarah. Sarah, please take it away.
Hello, good afternoon. For those of you on the East Coast, my name is Sarah Bentley Allred. I am the Forma convener on behalf of lifelong learning at Virginia Theological Seminary. We're going to start off with some panelist introductions. So everyone will go around, we'll share name, position, or something about their context, location. I'm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And then we're going to share with you a favorite Thanksgiving food. So mine is going to be, I'm going to go first so nobody steal it. Pumpkin pie is what I'm looking forward to making and eating this Thanksgiving. So I'm going to pass it over to Patty.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Patty Ames. I'm the canon for Christian formation in the Diocese of Southwestern Virginia, and I'm in our office right now in Roanoke, Virginia. And my favorite Thanksgiving food, I'm one of those people who mixes her food, and so it's stuffing mixed with cranberry sauce. And I will pass it over to my friend Marvin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marvin McLennan. I'm here in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Diocese of Arkansas. I'm the Director of Children and Youth Ministries at Christ Episcopal Church, and also the Forma Vice Chair. And see, my favorite Thanksgiving food. So I'm a sucker for like good, like baked mac and cheese. Like that, and then my wife makes a really good cranberries and cherries like side and I like to mix my food too, so like it just kind of like brings everything together. So I think those are my things, and then I'll send it over to Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy Berry. I'm on staff at St. Mark's Cathedral in Seattle, Washington, where I'm canon for intergenerational ministries. And I will confess that I never really liked dressing or stuffing until I started having Thanksgiving with my son's godparents. And so my dear friend Sue, Peter's godmother, makes an amazing cornbread and kale stuffing. And that's what I make now.
That sounds awesome. All right, I'm getting excited for Thanksgiving. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about faith formation today and beyond, where things are trending. Then each of our panelists are going to have a moment to respond. Please drop questions in the chat all through presentation, responsive panelists, because we are going to save a robust amount of time at the end for those questions, and certainly take a moment to tell you a little bit about Forma and our upcoming conference in January. All right, so let's jump in to faith formation in 2023 and beyond. So I'm going to start out with a quote from Maria Harris from the book Fashion Me a People, which you can see was published in 1989. Now we are in a time of movement towards a broader, more inclusive, and more complete understanding of what it means to educate. Such education includes education to and by teaching, to and by worship, to and by community, to and by proclamation, and prophetic speech, to and by service. So while I'm going to share with you 6 trends or kind of directions that we're seeing Christian formation shifting, these are by no means shifts that happened in the last year or 2 years or 5 years. There were actually folks who I would consider prophetic, including Maria Harris and also John Westerhoff, who were writing about these shifts back in the 80s. So the pandemic has sped some of this up, but it's been coming over the course of time. So the first shift that I want to touch on is a movement of the flow of knowledge. So previously, folks thought about knowledge as flowing in one direction, from teacher to student, and often adult to child or elder to younger. And the shift that's happening is towards a belief that there is wisdom in the room, there is wisdom in community, and to creating cultures of mutual reciprocity and learning, where we're actually learning from one another. And the belief that there is something that we can gain from relationship and conversation with people across the age spectrum and across the spectrum of spiritual development. So people ahead and behind us on the journey. A second shift to note is the previous assumption that Christian education happened through programming. So the traditional idea that youth group, Sunday school, Bible study, that is how we are formed. Shifting towards the idea that formation takes many forms, as that quote from Maria Harris indicated, formation is happening in worship, in our interpersonal relationships, in spiritual direction, in the service that we are doing. It's happening in all different parts of our lives and all different parts of the church ministry and work. A third shift has to do with age. So a previous assumption that the best model was to segregate by age, most aspects of church life being divided up by age group. And some of that in very large churches was even like first grade, second grade, third grade, teens, young adults, et cetera. And some of it was more children, youth, adult. Many of our churches still have these age groupings. The shift that's happening is to many more aspects of church life being intentionally intergenerational. And one of a key resource that I've used on intergenerational faith formation suggests that good practice might be about 70% of church life happening intentionally intergenerationally, and about 30% being intentionally in cohorts, age segregated or life stage segregated. So it's not that we need to be 100% intergenerational, but we need to be really thinking intentionally about when does it actually make sense to have all the preschoolers together separately, or when does it make sense to have older adults doing separately, and when does it make sense to all be together. So shift number 4, having to do with households with children. Previous assumption that parents were formed through their children's experience of Christian education. So we're going to educate the children, and then somehow it's going to like flow back up to the parents by osmosis, or the children are going to draw parents into church. And shift that's happening is that parents are being offered formation opportunities that relate to their own spiritual growth, that are intentionally geared to them. And parents are engaging in their own formation, perhaps specifically in the study of scripture is an area that many current parents are a little bit weak on. So how do we help parents have their own formation and feel more confident in being able to offer some formation at home to their children, which is point number 5, having to do with the location where Christian education or formation happens. And previously, we really thought about faith formation happening at church, in the church building. And more recently, there's a shift to imagining how can we support faith at home and in everyday life. So certainly for those households with children, how can we support parents in doing faith formation at home? And Wendy is actually a total expert on this, but also for other age groups, what does it look like to carry our faith in everyday life and to be living faithfully in school, in work, in all of the places that we engage in the world? And number 6, having to do with people's participation in worship, which many of us have seen. Previously, we assumed, and for many of us this was true, that most members of our church attended most weeks of the month of the year. And what we're seeing now is that many people are more likely to attend worship slightly less regularly, but are able to fully commit when there is a series or an event that is kind of time locked. People are able to make a fuller commitment and really follow that through. So those are 6 shifts that we wanted to highlight. This is a quote from Faith After the Pandemic, and we can send a link to this in the follow-up. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted much of American society, including religious worship. Rather than completely upending established patterns, the pandemic accelerated ongoing trends in religious change. So I think that won't be a surprise to many of you. We're just going to name a few of the pandemic impacts related to Christian formation. One of them is momentum, including patterns of attendance and kind of the process of leadership recruitment and training and handing those type of things down, but also just the momentum of programs have an energy, and it's like a train going down the track. And sometimes when the train comes to a very abrupt halt, it's hard to get going again. And some of that has to do with the interruption of those patterns and knowledge that is handed down. I think I'm going to use an example, Marvin, I think actually from your diocese, that after summer camp was disrupted for, I want to say 2 years, 1 year. Okay. There was a lack of transfer of knowledge of the camp songs that happened. And so there was a need to figure out how do we help the new campers that hadn't heard these songs last summer relearn? How do we help our new counselors learn this tradition and these songs? So momentum was one of impact of the pandemic. A second one impact is creativity. So a lot of super amazing creative things happened during the pandemic. I'm sure that you could fill the chat with examples. This includes the use of technology and hybrid programming, and it extends to many small ways that people found to continue being in relationship and offering formation, meeting in parking lots, or the church where I was working during the pandemic had a small group of parishioners who literally would bring a camping chair in their lunch, and they would eat lunch together once a week in the parking lot. And they became a really powerful support group for each other. A lot of folks who were living alone, and they offered support for each other and have continued to have really strong spiritual friendships since then. So a lot of creativity. A third pandemic impact, attendance. And that same article I mentioned previously reports that nearly all who no longer attend worship services at all were those who infrequently attended before the pandemic. So while I think we have seen many of our congregations have a lower average Sunday attendance, according to the data, it's sort of the peripheral people who were sort of irregular attenders, and then they stopped attending altogether. Many of our core folks kind of stayed with us through the pandemic, but we've lost those people who didn't have deep ties, and that does result in lower participation and attendance. And then a third thing to note being a fourth thing being trauma, collective trauma. All of us, had some amount of anxiety and stress that happened during this pandemic, and other folks had much larger impacts of trauma. So trauma, the pandemic impacted different groups of people differently. There's also, I think, an acceleration of grief about changes happening in the church. So if Maria Harris and John Westerhoff were writing, 30 years ago about these shifts that were happening in church, and it's been slowly bubbling and boiling, and maybe Sunday school has gotten slowly smaller, or things have slowly changed, the pandemic really accelerated those things coming to fruition. And so maybe some churches, don't have Sunday school anymore. And there perhaps for some folks is some real grief in that we need to recognize as well. So I'm gonna stop my screen share, and we're gonna move into our time of response from our panelists. Is anybody very eager to go first and just talk a little bit about which of these trends resonates with your own experience in recent years, or if you want to say this one didn't resonate at all and this is what I'm seeing in my context? Anybody eager to go first? Wendy, all right, kick us off.
Well, I would like to talk about intergenerational faith formation, which is not a program. It is not code for children and families, or even children and youth and some adults thrown in. It is a culture. But it is also something that is not new. And I will say it is immediately resonant with my current position because I was hired with this in my title, but it was also something that I got to dive into in my previous ministry context at Trinity Church, Wall Street. And it was true of the church where I grew up. It was really significant, I think, that when I was 14, I sang in the choir, I taught Sunday school, and I was on my church's Christian education committee, which met on Sunday afternoons so that I could actually attend. And that was the year that my parents separated. And my mother, in her sadness for a while, did not go to church. I got on the bus and I went by myself because I was pretty well convinced they could not have church without me. So it is a passion of mine to make sure that the place where I'm serving now, we are really intentional about the integrating children and youth into the full life of the congregation. We can be intergenerational when children and youth are not present. That is absolutely a thing. I use a definition from Holly Catterton Allen and Christine Lawton Ross in their book, Intergenerational Christian Formation, Bringing the Whole Church Together in Ministry, Community, and Worship. And here's the definition. An intergenerational outlook acknowledges that the gifts every generation brings to the spiritual formation of other generations strengthens the whole church. A faith community that practices intergenerational ministry will use these gifts, creating frequent opportunities for various generations to communicate in various ways, to interact on a regular basis, and to worship and serve together regularly. And intergenerational experiences are experiences in which multiple representatives of two or more generations are present and engaged in mutual activities. So again, children and youth don't have to be present, but if most of a church's intergenerational offerings are, say, from ages 25 to 85, there's something missing. And possibly what's missing is that children and youth have not been invited into the planning. It's really important that we don't just think about including all generations. This happens often with our 20s and 30s. We have a really robust 20s and 30s program, and people will come to the convener of the 20s and 30s program and say, we'd really love to have young adults at this event. And she'll say, oh, how wonderful and interesting. Did you include them in the planning of this event? And is there a part where you can bring them into leadership? Same is true of the younger generations too. I have a lot more I could say, but I'm going to stop here.
All right, well, pause on that thought, Wendy, and Marvin or Patty, do you want to jump in? We have plenty of time, so yeah, Patty, go ahead, and we'll get to you,
Sure,
Marvin.
thank you. I think one that jumped out at me was the model that we're moving from programs to that realization that all we do is formational, whether it's in church, in a program, in a class, in the hallways, at coffee hour, and in the grocery store. It's wherever we are and all that we do. And so it's what I have recognized and getting a lot of questions on the diocesan level is we have people coming from a lot of different aspects to our church. We have people that are unchurched in church, and we have people that have been there for a long time. And finding those various and different on-ramps is what I call them, that one model does not fit. It's not a one size fits all anymore. And that can create a little bit more work. But to me, it's that creativity of finding those various on-ramps so that people can connect, that can come in and start on the surface, but then start to go deeper and find those relationships. So as I talked about with my Thanksgiving food, I like to mix these things together. And a lot of these shifts to me seem to mix together. So it's those on-ramps of finding different ages to be together and learning from that. And I learned that at an early age. Wendy was talking about her childhood. I am willing to confess that I am a Sunday school dropout. I did not like Sunday school as a kid. And look at me now. But what happened was my parents gave me a couple of choices, and I could go work in the nursery, I could go read, or I could go to adult forum. And I went to the adult forum, and the practice there was the rector would call on someone to pray before the class started. You didn't know who was getting called on. And after I had been there for a couple of months, he called on me. And my mother exclaimed, evidently out loud, "Oh God." And he said, "No, not you. I want Patty to pray." And so I did. I didn't know what to pray, but I prayed something. And what was transformational was what happened after that class, of the other adults that were in there thanking me for my prayer and being supportive of that. And so it's the walking together with all ages and people in all stages. The other thing that jumped out to me quickly was location, the shift in location, that, you know, talking about faith at home, but talking about faith in other places, faith just outside in creation. There's several studies that have recently come out saying people, you know, and I think we learned that from COVID, right? We were outside a lot, is people want to be outside. And so how can we adapt where we are and enjoy God's creation and each other on that journey together? And I'll stop there and let Marvin jump in.
I feel like I could kind of bow out because I feel like between Wendy and Patty, y'all have kind of talked about a lot what I was focusing on. But yeah, I think, and to Patty's point, there were a lot of things I agreed with that. Was so like, I love the chance to be like creative in my ministry, and you know, like outside of church work, like I'm a big old nerd, so like I love D&D and like all that, and the idea of just kind of like getting to like say yes and to things and getting to like shift gears to like, okay, so we have this situation, what can come from that, and like what creativity can stem from that. And like as Episcopalians, as Christians, we're like a resurrection people, so that means like with our ministries, sometimes our ministries might fade away, might like die off, but something beautiful might come from that. So with COVID, like Sarah was saying, like you know, we had to think differently on how we did different ministries. So one thing that really jumped out to me was it's like every year we have, like pre-COVID, we have our Mardi Gras party, and we had it in the gym, and it was always like a really nice time, and we had families come in. And during, I guess like during when we were allowed to be together outside, we were like, okay, well, do we want to chance it? It's kind of starting to spike again. So what do we want to do? And we kind of came up with the idea of turning it into a block party. And we're a downtown parish. So like we have our church and we have some apartment buildings like across the street. And one of the memories that always stands out to me is like we had our band come out and like they were playing like in our parking lot. We had tables out, and I just remember like looking at the band, looking at the parishioners and the kids like dancing around, and then looking out into the apartments and like people like opening up their windows and listening, and some of our unhoused neighbors coming up and like joining in the mix. And I feel like that was real ministry, is the fact that everybody was coming together and like for that moment. And yeah, so that was one moment. And in terms of families too, we've pre-COVID, we were using not Godly Play, Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. And it was one of those situations where like it just wasn't working at our parish as much. So we've kind of shifted into a model of taking our first semester and kind of talking about, what is the Episcopal Church? What are you doing on Sunday mornings? And like, what are they doing in big church? And I have some great volunteers whose kids are part of the program, and like they're teachers. And we've had field trips into big church. And so this past Sunday, we're talking about the Eucharist. And 2 Sundays ago, we were talking about Liturgy of the Word. This past Sunday, we were talking about communion. And I invited our altar guild to kind of get in on the fun and say, hey, could we go to the sacristy and you show us like the bread and the wine and kind of how everything goes? And like, oh yeah, we'd love to. And like, luckily one of our amazing like altar guild volunteers like loves geeking out about that stuff. So he was able to like talk about it, and the kids were able to like pick up on everything and we're really engaged and we're asking questions. And we've had about 3 of these field trips. We had one when we were talking about baptism. So we went to the baptismal font, one when we talked about communion, all that. And I found that the parents afterwards were like, I never knew that. And it was a really cool moment to see like the gears turning in like the kids' heads and the parents, and just everybody kind of coming together for that. And I think that was really just a really neat moment.
I think that's a great example, Marvin, of something that can be for all ages. That's we've just started doing something similar behind the scenes with the Altar Guild, behind the scenes with the Flower Guild, behind the scenes with the organist, and that is formational for all ages.
Wendy, I think that touches on a question that came up in the chat having to do with opportunities for adult formation. And one thing that comes to mind for me, and then I'll let others weigh in on adult formation, is sometimes as adult, we can get a little too settled in our routine when it comes to going to church, and we show up and we're in the pew, and we Episcopalians may have parts of the Book of Common Prayer memorized, and we're just kind of like rolling through the motions there. And so actually, I was just thinking, offering adults who have never participated in Flower Guild, Altar Guild, served as a crucifer, torchbearer, served the chalice, offering some of those opportunities to adults can be really formational when paired with, for example, having someone from the Altar Guild talk about it. And I would even say, I would love to hear from that person on the Altar Guild, like, how is this a spiritual practice for you? Or how is this part of your spiritual life? Not just a task that you're doing on behalf of the congregation, but what does this have to do with your relationship with God and your ongoing spiritual development? So I think I love intergenerational worship in particular, and wish that we kind of used that hub more as an opportunity for formation for all ages, and kind of went outward from that. But any other thoughts on adult formation?
Spiritual practices is definitely very high on the list here with our community. And yes, every time we do one of these behind the scenes with, the focus is, how is this a spiritual practice? And what part of that spiritual practice can you take either into your home life or participate in here at church. Just about adult formation, I would say we've got an amazing 6-week model for scripture study that is not lectionary based. We choose a theme, we choose 6 scripture passages. This was this actually came to our dean, Steve Thomason, in a dream that we were going to do these, what he calls the Radix Project. And that's something that's really accessible on our website. Anyone can use them, but we're in Radix 11. So we've had this experience 11 times. And people who began in just before the pandemic, these groups, we do 2 a year now because there's just more going on. But it's a beautiful way for a small group of people, about 8 people, to get to know each other really well and use scripture as a way of understanding their own spiritual journeys.
Wendy, to kind of piggyback off of that, in terms of like doing a series of things, that made me think of, and just kind of building those relationships, going back to the slide talking about the model section. I found that, in a post-COVID world, for me and like our youth group, like we were needing to build those relationships again and kind of get that train back, like moving again. And I'll never forget, like the first Sunday that we had youth group back in the youth room, I remember like me and my assistant were getting ready, and it was just this eerie quietness. I turned around and the kids were just kind of sitting there. And it's like, y'all do know you can like go play air hockey, like talk to each other. And I realized that they were needing to kind of just get back into the rhythm of being in community with one another again. So I was like, okay, like I have this whole like plan set out, but my friend Emma, who works at another Episcopal church here in town, has this great phrase that's like sat with me for ages now. It's this is a plan, not the plan. So whenever I have my like youth lesson and like I'm like really excited about it, if the kids aren't feeling it and are just like wanting to chill and talk about their day or talk about their week, I'd much rather hear about their rosebud thorn, like what's something good, what's something not so good, what's something they're looking forward to. I'd much rather hear about that than do my lesson plan, because I think it's all about building those relationships. And like a couple of weeks ago, we started kind of having one-off events too at Christ Church. And one of the offerings that we had was like a parish bike ride. And because we realized that a lot of them are super into biking, and it's like, oh, well, what if this is their spiritual practice? Like, this is how they're able to get out into the world and go beyond the church walls and be connected to God through biking. So it's like, okay, well, let's do that in community with one another. Because Arkansas weather thought differently to have it that day, but it's like having those kinds of opportunities to come together that I think are just another great form of ministry and formation.
I echo that, Marvin. I think it's so important to think of that shift from program, and not to drop program, but to think about relationships with all ages. And for the adult formation, one thing that I would recommend is story sharing. And that's available on the Episcopal Church website. And we did that at our last diocesan convention as an exercise. And we had our little timeline, and people kept sharing and wanted to share. And I just took my watch off. I was like, we need to take the time to do this. People have stories to share. And we also need to listen. We need to listen to other people's stories and create that space where we do that. And I believe the same is true of children and youth. Children and youth have great stories to tell. As someone who was a children's minister for 22 years, I always say children are some of the best theologians I know. And we need to give them their time and space to share that story, their story, and for others to hear those. And someone in the chat was asking about youth and youth showing up. And it goes back to that location, the shift. They may not be showing up at church, and it might be that we have to show up in other places. I go to a lot of sporting events and did in the past, plays. But one of the things that I connected with is I found where the youth were going. And when I worked in Lynchburg years ago, they were all going to this little kind of really pub, but in the afternoon, it was the kids' place to hang out. There was a pool table and they had the best fries in town. And so I would hang out there and play pool with the kids and talk. And I think we had church there because church can be anywhere. It's about the relationship, not necessarily the building.
On that note, I'm going to take a brief pause to talk about Forma, and then we're going to come back to our Q&A. So Forma is the network for Christian formation professionals in the Episcopal Church and beyond. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about our values. And then I'm going to drop a link to, we are a membership organization, and we also have an annual conference. So I'll drop those links in the chat. So formation is one of our core values. We have the goal of equipping the saints for ministry by forming Christian leaders who shape the church. Our second core value is networking. So connecting with individuals and also organizations. So this webinar is part of our strategic partnership networking core value for sharing work, wisdom, and community. Another one of our core values is advocacy. So we're actively working for the advancement of Christian formation, lifelong, holistic formation across the Episcopal Church, and particularly advocating for justice in the vocation of lay professionals. We were founded by lay professionals. And then collaboration. So partnering with formation leaders, practitioners, our members, dioceses, and mission-aligned organizations to accomplish our mission. So for our members, we have monthly programming as well as a platform where folks can engage with each other, ask questions. And we're doing a lot of monthly meetups recently to try to help folks. We have, for example, tomorrow a meetup for anybody, any member of Forma doing youth ministry, that folks can gather in specific cohorts and go deeper into conversation. So if you'd like to look into Forma membership, there are multiple price points. I just dropped the link in the chat. And then we have a conference coming up in January that I'll drop a link to. And our theme is Away in the Wilderness. So coming from Isaiah, behold, I am doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert, which we felt was particularly poignant coming out of COVID. Where are the rivers that God is making in the desert, in our own lives, in the church, in Christian formation? Okay, so I'm gonna ask a couple more questions from the chat. Is anyone using a playground in their church? And if so, do you set an age cap? I'll throw that out to you panelists.
We have something like a playground. We don't call it that, but it's a large carpet with rocking chairs and toys that's up front where the kids have a really good view of what's happening on the chancel. But we request that parents sit there as well. So it is not just for kids, parents, grandparents, caregivers, it's everyone. So we've not needed to set an age limit.
I have some parishes that do something similar, and some do have age limits and some don't. And I think it depends on probably each parish's context in some degree, because children of different ages learn in different ways. And we want to also be inclusive of those who might have learning differences, and make sure everyone feels welcome if there's a place that they are more comfortable instead of in the pew.
Yeah, we don't have one. We have our children's chapel. So after everybody processes in, the kids get to meet the volunteers in the back of the church. And that's been working out really well. Like we have an incredible group of volunteers that help kind of guide them through, and we have our own little liturgy and everything. But we do offer every month is the third Sunday of every month. We have our family worship service, and that's when they get to come up and like see everything like right there at the altar.
And I dropped a link in the chat. My favorite idea that is adjacent to Playground is to have more than one comfortable space in your worship area and more than one shelf with various materials, and to not limit it by age, but rather to say like people of various ages have a need to do something with their hands during worship. Like in my own congregation, we have somebody who knits, and I love it. Because I think it just demonstrates that there are many of us who focus better when we are using our hands. So there's more information at that link. Thank you, Sylvia Musha Miller, for those ideas. I want to address one Forma conference related question. So this year we are actually doing a new thing. It is not an only online conference. It is a radically hybrid conference. So we are trying to address the conundrum that one of the reasons people go to a Forma conference is solidarity, connection, and networking. And having a single location on-site conference is extremely expensive. So many of the folks that came to our conference in January 2023 spent $1,000 to $1,500 to go to that conference between registration, hotel expenses, and travel. And it just wasn't accessible to a lot of the folks that we really care about having access to this. So our radically hybrid conference will stream through Zoom. You can participate individually online from anywhere, or you can choose to go to one of our conference center retreats at Cayuga Conference Center in North Carolina or Camp Allen in Texas. Or a third option is to go to a local conference gathering. And I know, Patty, I haven't gotten the one in Southwestern Virginia up on the website quite yet, but we have about 7, I think, up on the website at last check, and I'll drop that link in the chat. And so these are open gatherings across the country. We even have a Google map where you can see folks are gathering. So it is not a single location conference, but there are folks gathering, Forma folks gathering for community around our conference this year. All right, let me keep going down our questions. So I'm at a small church where almost all leadership and planning comes from the vestry. How might youth and children's voices be heard in planning in that structure? I think we put a couple ideas in the chat already. Anything else you want to add about involving children and youth in planning?
One thing that we've done that's worked out really well is with our annual meeting in January, we'll have that in the morning, and then EYC for that evening will be us having our own annual meeting. And I'll say like, okay, like what do y'all want to do in the coming year? Like what do y'all want to do in church? And they'll come up with a list of things, and then we'll kind of like take that stack and then try and fit it into where we can. And that's seemed to be going out really well past couple of years.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to keep going with these questions. Okay, I wrestle with the lectionary as an adequate teaching tool. Seasons, yes. Week to week, no. If someone comes into our church brand new to Christianity, the lectionary seldom offers a cohesive model of teaching to them for any age. I would personally agree with this. I am not only, raised in the church. My mom is a priest, and I think it wasn't until I started working with Godly Play as a children's minister that I began to understand the full arc of the biblical narrative and how these random, somewhat seemingly random to me stories were actually connected to a bigger picture of the story of God and God's people. So I would agree with that. What other thoughts on the lectionary do you guys have, panelists?
There are several questions in here about biblical literacy and that sort
Yeah.
of thing. And yes, there's great things that can happen in age cohorts, and lots of resources that are available, even free and no, low cost ones. But godly play for children actually through 5th grade is amazing, and a way that I think we now are reaping the benefits of having, a couple of generations of children now who grew up with that and have become, some of them have become clergy and leaders in their congregations, and they know the biblical stories, they know the narrative really, really well. Our teens sometimes do a text study when there's a problematic lectionary text coming up. And that's a conversation they engage in with adults and staff members, which has been really helpful. As I mentioned, we've got a number of different ways into the study of scripture, including the 6 weeks, 6-week deep dive into a particular area. But I would say that for new Christians, they need to know first how we read the Bible, because that's it. Even if they're not new Christians, but they're new to this more perhaps expansive view of Christianity, they're going to be wrestling with that. So we do a 4-week inquirers class, and one of the 4 topics is about how we read the Bible. And we give them some experiences to do that with, some spiritual practices. Each of our inquirers classes has an accompanying spiritual practice and tools for that, for them to use on their own.
I would share a story of creativity that one of the parishes in this diocese did. It started during COVID, and she was wrestling with biblical literacy, but also connecting folks. And I said, well, what is something that you like? And what can we creatively think that people could do and then share? And so she came up with this great idea, because she got the Washington Post, and then the Post around Easter, they have the peeps, the little marshmallow things, and make scenes. And so she got them to do, and the first year was parables, and whether it was families reading the scripture together and then creating, as she called it, the peep show. And then they would take pictures and post them on their social media and exchange them. But groups could come together as adults. And it became such a huge thing that they really enjoyed doing, both the activity, but the Bible study time to really dive into that. And how would you depict that parable or the I am statements and stories in scripture, in the gospel? And so that's just another way to think about it. Doesn't always have to be in a traditional Bible story or study way, but to have some creativity with it as well. And give it a great name, like the Peep Show.
That's fabulous.
One thing we've done, because I saw there was a question too about gamification, and so kind of combining that with this question, so I don't know if y'all know about the game What Do You Mean? It has like, it's just like kind of like apples to apples esque, but it's like pictured, like the cards are like memes. And so I ended up getting like a box for the youth room, and then ended up like taking out like the inappropriate cards or like inappropriate like memes, but ended up turning it into a Bible lesson of like talking about the parables or like incorporating the Bible story. So it's like, okay, so you have this Bible story using these memes, like using these cards, recreate the Bible story. And it got competitive, but like they loved it though. And we've kind of turned that into about like kind of an annual practice too, of like, okay, let's talk about this like Bible lesson, and 3, 2, 1, go. And yeah, so that was really fun.
All right, here's another question, comment from the chat. I love the energy that you all have about shifting into new understandings of formation. We are currently experiencing a good bit of frustration with trying to find those on-ramps for formation. And I would also add that I do not in any way want to minimize the difficulty of these shifts, because what we're really talking about here is culture change. The church has been doing certain things a certain way for a very long time, like generations long time. And so we can see some of these shifts happening when we zoom out really big picture. But when we zoom in and we're talking about actual, Cindy, who sits in pew 3 on the left and has a deep emotional connection to, something that's changing, it's really tricky. Culture change is really tricky. So I wanted to say, anybody have any wisdom around this culture change piece?
I would just jump in and say you're not alone in that I think everyone to some degree or at some point has run into that. That's what I hear a lot. But the thing that I say to my folks is that there are no failures, they're learning experiences, and we keep trying. So this is the way I talk about it with folks. It's like cooking spaghetti. And you cook it, and when you think it's done, you throw it against the wall, and if it sticks, that is awesome and it works. Sometimes it does not stick, and you either have to put it back in the pot, cook it a little more, try again, and it's an ongoing, it's a journey, and it's not a race. We can't go out and, let me go try all these things right now. But we have parishes that just try one thing, and they may have to tweak it some, and do that, but then they do that one thing well. And I think to think in those terms, but yes, it is challenging and it is a struggle.
Can I give an example, Patty?
Yes.
So I love the idea of like time boxed experiments, because I feel like people are less resistant when you tell them it's like, it's only going to be 4 weeks and then we're gonna reflect upon it, but it's only gonna last 4 weeks. And I was chatting with somebody who was struggling to get new people like into the rota of worship leadership, for like it's the same lectors and whatnot that are scheduled every week, and other people aren't being invited in, and these people are aging. And so I was like, well, what if you and also the person doing this scheduling has done it for a number of years. And so I said, well, what if you take the season of Lent, for example, or Advent, whatever, doesn't matter, 7 weeks, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, and you say, okay, we're going to invite people to try once, we're going to invite them to try lecturing. We're going to invite them to try once during Lent, and we're going to tell the scheduler, hey, don't worry about Lent. We're going to have new people come in and we're just going to try it out. And then after that, you have the opportunity to do some formation with these new people coming in. What does it mean to be a lector? How does that, is it a spiritual practice, etc.? How is it done well? And then afterwards to reflect like, okay, was that meaningful to you? Do you want to keep doing it? Do you want to be added to the rota? Or are you like, one and done is good? So just like a small example of like trying an experiment for a set number of weeks and then reflecting upon it and perhaps letting it go. Or like Patty said, like deciding, ooh, that did not work. That spaghetti did not stick on the wall. We have just a few more minutes. So Wendy or Marvin on culture change and making these changes in church.
I just put in the chat, a dear clergy colleague recently reminded me that shifting a culture takes 7 years. It is not for the faint-hearted, but it is something that can be done gradually. We don't have to shift all at once, and the shifts are happening whether or not we want them. So there is an extent to which we are along for the ride, and as pleasant as we can make that ride, the better off it will be for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. I love the idea of the time box of like, okay, we're just gonna do this for like a month and then just to test things out. And yeah,
Friends, if we did not get to your question, really sorry, but I did drop a link in the chat. Lifelong Learning offers open office hours. I am generally the Monday host, and my colleague, Jody Belcher, who is the lead editor of Building Faith, is the Thursday host. You can also find us panelists on the Forma space, which is our membership space, or the Forma Facebook group. So we would love to continue to be in conversation. This is definitely not a one-off conversation. It is very, very much ongoing. I want to thank you, Patty, Wendy, and Marvin, for taking time to do this. And I want to thank you so much, Joe and Episcopal Parish Network, for inviting Forma to be part of this. We are really glad to be in partnership with you. And I know that this is being recorded. I'm not sure if the chat comments will be recorded or saved. So I don't know if Joe is able to answer that. But okay, we'll post the chat with the recording. Great. Thank you so much, friends. Have a fabulous afternoon. Looking forward to seeing you in other contexts.